Okay. So, Anthony Albo, and his government have put a referendum to the Australian people that we're all in the process of voting on. And it states a proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration? Obviously, there's been heap mudslinging from both sides of the campaign. The yes campaigners accusing no campaigners of racism and disrespecting First Australians, and no campaigners accusing yes supporters of everything from harassment to manipulating the press. Obviously, like most political discussions in Australia, and to be fair, all over the democratic world, it's devolved into a little bit of a shit show, one that we're going to obviously wade right into. We want to analyze claims from both sides of the referendum question so we can paint a picture that at least approximates the truth of the matter without worrying about which side of the aisle you're on, or being called racist or anything like that. And we should probably start with the question itself. Obviously, if you have any comments or questions as I go through this, feel free to ask in the live chat. But it's not so much a question as it is a proposal for a new thing. And step one is altering the Constitution itself, which is fairly straightforward, although it happens incredibly rarely in Australia and almost never in the United States. I think 1789 was the last amendment, the 27th Amendment, although it wasn't fully ratified until sometime in the late 90s. And the last referendum we held down under was in 1999 to finally remove the yoke of our great British motherland and become a republic. And a majority voted no on that question in every state and territory. There was a second question on the referendum as well, on a preamble to the Constitution. Altering the Constitution to insert a preamble that starts with hope in God, which itself might have turned a few people off. This is no legal impact. This is just a few nice fuzzy words that would be found at the beginning of the document. But I think the big part of this preamble was honouring Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders, the nation's first people, for their deep kinship with their lands and for the ancient and continuing cultures which enrich the life of our country. As you can see, even that, which had no legal effect, got a resounding no vote. So, why did it fail? I mean, why did the referendum on the Republic fail as well? Because a whole bunch of polling on a variety of different Republican models, like where the citizens directly elect a president, like they do in the United States, or states putting up candidates, or the Parliament itself choosing a president, kind of like they do with the Governor General right now. But most of the polling at the time showed a majority support for the idea, but it still failed. And we have to ask why it failed. Now, the key thing is that most referendums do fail because changing the founding legal document of the nation is a pretty big ask. So you have to be rock solid on your reasons why if you're going to suggest changing the constitution. And as will become apparent as we dive into the voice referendum, the devil is in the detail. If the government of the day provides too much detail, which I would argue is what they did in the 1999 Republic referendum, if they specify the model too specifically, it divides the vote of the people who would support a republic. A ton of Australian Republicans would just never accept the Parliament choosing a president, because that's effectively renaming the office of the Governor General. And a lot of monarchists aren't into the idea of presidential politics. In fact, a lot of people in Australia are not into the idea of US-style presidential politics. They're worried we'll become too much like America and have year-round electoral cycles, and you split that with the Senate, the lower house, and the presidency, and it's a non-stop campaign. Now, the good lad, Malcolm Turnbull, was in charge of the campaign for the yes referendum at the time. Remember him? He's the one who came out and said at the start, when he was Prime Minister, he said, I would never support a voice because it would effectively become a third chamber of Parliament. And now he is one of the Yes campaign's most prominent figures, campaigning with Tanya Plibersek of the current Labor government. So he's changed his political stripes quite significantly since being rolled by the Conservatives in the Liberal Party. He's held a little bit of a grudge. There he is, hanging out with his political fellow travellers. He also has a ongoing vendetta against the current Liberal Party and the Murdoch press. He's constantly retweeting articles from The Guardian that get stuck into characters like Peter Dutton, also known as Mr. Potato. The parties of the centre-right are abandoning the centre. Well, you could argue that if he was better at managing his party, if he was a little more politically savvy, he would have kept the party, the Liberal Party that is, in the centre-right. We wouldn't have a lot of teal candidates now in formerly safe Liberal seats, and the Liberal Party drifting towards becoming a purely Conservative party. But back to The Voice. I think the biggest problem facing The Voice is the issue of detail. Albo can't specify the voice model too specifically, or he risks running another 1999 Republican referendum. It's a quandary. He steadfastly refused to provide detail on what the voice actually is until the country has agreed to lock it into the Constitution. If he provides the more details he provides, like the powers or the manner in which governments must account for its feedback, its legislative, its ability to affect the legislative process, then support for the overall idea of an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice would almost without question decline. There are already Aboriginal members of Parliament who don't want the voice, either because they think it'll be completely ineffective, which would be like Lydia Thorpe from the Greens, or because it'll have an effect on absolutely everything and have too much power, which is sort of equally unproven in my humble opinion. But most of what we do know about the voice comes from the Uluru Statement. The key components of the Aboriginal voice. There shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Obviously, that it'll make representations to Parliament and executive government. That's crucial, on any matters relating to Indigenous Australians. And finally, and crucially, that the Parliament will, subject to this Constitution, before or after, we don't know, have the power to make laws with respect to matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, including its composition, functions, powers, and procedures. Now, those first 2 points don't really tell us anything, but the last point is where I believe the yes side, and maybe more specifically the Albanese government, has let itself down. The Parliament retaining the right to alter this new body, its powers, its composition, and how Aboriginal people would get elected to it would probably assuage the biggest complaint of the No campaign to date, and that is too much is left undecided until the referendum has already passed. But the phrase subject to this constitution could mean different things depending on how Albanese goes about it. If the wording in the actual constitution is pre-referendum, pre-constitutional amendment, then subject to this constitution effectively means subject to normal everyday governing rules, and that leaves the bulk of the Voice's implementation up to the government of the day, obviously with the ability to be altered and changed by future governments, if not totally removed, because it's locked into the constitution. But if subject to this constitution includes phrases that specifically define matters relating to Atsi peoples as anything and everything the federal government does, or that executive government cannot proceed until certain feedback has been either sought or factored in from the Voice, or that allow elected Voice representatives to challenge government decisions in the High Court, the scope of the Voice grows much, much wider. And as I said, it could effectively encompass everything the federal government does, as everything the government does affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island peoples to a greater or lesser extent. Now, there are good reasons to vote no and good reasons to vote yes, but I think the best way to break it down would be to run through the main points from either side before we check out some of the media melees that have broken out between some of the more prominent yes and no figures. So, this is the official AEC pamphlet. We've got 8 reasons to vote yes and 10 reasons to vote no. So let's start by going through the no side. Legally risky. The Voice is legally risky. The biggest change to our constitution ever, not road tested, no comparable bodies anywhere else in the world, provides an avenue for legal challenge and interpretation by the High Court. It's true that it hasn't been tested, and if it could genuinely have been, then I think it could genuinely have been if the Parliament would simply legislate a voice. There's nothing in our constitution as it stands forbidding something like this, and you could argue it's been tried with other bodies like ATSIC, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, which was a bit of a failure actually, but it's never been tested like this, where we have elected Indigenous representatives from all over the country to the Voice, who then make representations to the Parliament and the Cabinet. As for the High Court challenge, yes, legislation could be challenged by the Voice, or we assume it can, given we don't have any details to the contrary. But if it couldn't have any impact on legislation, it sort of eliminates the point of the exercise in the first place. If the Voice can't have a real impact on policy direction, then everything the Yes campaign says about making a difference to life expectancy, infant mortality, education rates, it becomes a pointless exercise in the first place. We might as well just send out pollsters to communities like Fitzroy Crossing and see what they come back with. There's no back and forth. It's not a conversation with Indigenous people. It's just them saying stuff to the government, which they can do already, even if they can't impact the policy outcomes. The second point, no details. There are no details. Not entirely true. There are some details, but I think this point would be one of my biggest bugbears, particularly given how disdainful our national politicians and state leaders already are to the Constitution. but we sort of covered the double-edged sword that can be. If they provide too much detail, then they kill the opportunity for it to pass. If they provide no detail, they're effectively asking us to sign Albo and co. a blank check. Take, for example, border closures, expressly forbidden by the Constitution, and the High Court's decided that that's unless absolutely necessary. And governments like the WA Labor government have a really, really, really absurdly low bar for what counts as absolutely necessary. They kept their borders closed months and months after everyone else in the country had reopened the borders. And one of the clearest parts of our Constitution is shall not be infringed. No, wait, that's the that's the Second Amendment. Intercourse between states shall be absolutely free, meaning the movement of people and goods, economic activity. And then you've got the WA government locking up Melburnians for sneaking into the AFL Grand Final. They treat the document like a fucking joke, to be honest. So if you're going to ask us to change the Constitution, we need to be convinced that these changes are rock solid and open to as little interpretation as humanly possible, because absolutely free can be changed on the whim of some judge to mean absolutely free unless a politician decides it's important. And everyone has a different bar for that. Unlike America, where shall not be infringed has been taken to mean civilians can own semi-automatic rifles and handguns. They have a much stronger literal interpretation of their constitution than we do here in Australia. But it's got to be open to as little interpretation by lifetime appointed judges who, most of them haven't lived in the real world since their teenage years or early 20s. Move on to point number 3. It divides us. Arguable. Division is there anyway, honestly. As long as one group of Australians, whether it be a racial group, a cultural group, an ethnic group, an age group, a demographic, but as long as any particular group of Australians need or want their own governmental advisory bodies, that division's not going anywhere. It's built into the political process, and it doesn't have to be Cronulla riot style division. You guys remember the friggin' Cronulla riots? This is very serious racial division. Pretty intense stuff.
The following content is
not just a few Middle Eastern bars. It's not.
The scenes
we don't want
slavery.
Jones.
I'd forgotten just how confronting.
Well, that's just a friggin' protest. Anyway, they were bad. They were very, very bad. It doesn't have to be Cronulla-style racial division. It can just be normal political divisions, and those divisions likely exist anyway. And these the voice is being proposed as a way to seal up some of those divisions, but whether or not it actually does that is up for discussion. Number 4, it won't help Indigenous Australians. Potentially true, but really hard to say without having the legislated model in front of us and having taken it for a test drive beforehand, which again I argue could have been done. There's nothing in the Constitution stopping a voice being legislated. So does it need to be in the Constitution? I mean, it is exactly what Indigenous leaders from across the country have brainstormed, consulted communities on, and explicitly asked for. So even if it didn't work, there's not going to be any white guilt or colonial hangovers attached to it. This is their proposal. This has been thoroughly consultative. You're not going to get a better idea from polls on what Aboriginal people actually want. No issue is beyond its scope. Scope too broad. Also pretty difficult to answer without sufficient detail beforehand. It could comment on mostly rural and regional community issues, or it could comment on and challenge absolutely anything and everything. There's no real way to know until it's up and running. Delay and dysfunction. The risk of dysfunctional government I think they're referring to here is kind of funny, since almost all democratic government is dysfunctional to some degree anyway. The legal appeals and consultation involved in the voice are obviously, again, by design, because without this, there's not much point to the exercise, and that's not inherently a bad thing. It opens the door for activists. Yes, but this is a political issue. This isn't inherent to the voice mechanism. Activism is already a major part of Indigenous affairs and all affairs as governed from Canberra, where the Indigenous education rate is very, very high, higher than the general population in some other parts of the country. But the activists are not the ones dealing with young children getting raped or decaying settlements being locked down by state governments to prevent disease for their own good. There have been statements made, obviously, indicating that the voice is a first step towards reconciliation rather than an end goal in itself. This is generally being pushed by people who then want to go on to create a treaty between governments and the many and varied Aboriginal tribes. And whether or not these things become reality is entirely up to future governments and the political process. That's not inherent in the voice. It's effectively a slippery slope argument. If it becomes a reality, then that's a separate political decision that we discuss separately. It will be costly and bureaucratic. Yes, and ATSIC, the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Commission, proved this, with corruption and wasteful spending being the main takeaways from this government body that's now defunct. But any solution to the issues facing Indigenous Australia will involve a high level of bureaucracy, and there's just no way around that. We already spend a phenomenal amount of money trying and failing to solve problems, so I don't think you can argue cost as a reason not to try this. But the bureaucracy, yeah, there's no way around that. There's going to be a significant extra bureaucratic load involved in the voice. This voice will be permanent. It will not be in legislation that can be reversed. Okay, I think I get what they're trying to say here, that it's not going to be a simple act of parliament that can be repealed. But remember, the parliament will be setting all the parameters via legislation. So even if it can't be reversed, it can be significantly altered to be almost anything. And better alternatives, better ways forward. A better way forward might have been having a voice referendum as separate from the question of constitutional recognition, as in the preamble that failed to pass in 1999. although polling now shows that has fairly sizable support. But by wrapping them up into one package, Albert, he might have shot himself and Indigenous Australians in the foot, because if it fails, oof, that's rough. There's not going to be anything like this on the table again for many years, maybe decades. And something might have been better than nothing. For example, a recognition in the constitutional preamble and a legislated voice that is not permanent but can be tried for 5-10 years, assess the trends that result from that, and then legislate in the constitution at a later date. But that's it's too late for that now. That option's gone. But as far as practical solutions, like a better ways forward, what are they? What are the practical solutions and the better ways? If someone from the no camp cares to explain, because everything we've tried over the last 60 plus years has either failed or been so marginally effective that it's barely been worth doing. I mean, it's pretty easy to say, yes, there are better ways, we don't need a voice, but you're not providing any details themselves. And details is one of your biggest points as to why we shouldn't do this. So I think you're trying to have a bob each way there. The details theme is a common one throughout this referendum, and I guess most referendums. So let's check out the yes side. Whoops. It came from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people directly. This is true. There was a massive meeting of Indigenous leaders in Alice Springs after a whole bunch of regional dialogues had been held in prominent First Nations places. The consultation underlying the Uluru Statement from the Heart was excellent. You'd have a really hard time saying this is just a back of the napkin idea courtesy of activists. There's a whole lot of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander support behind this voice proposal. Constitutional recognition. This will provide concrete results. Less true. It's either going to provide concrete results or it's not going to change everything that much. It can't really be both at the same time. Every time we've tried a new executive government department or an advisory body, we've poured billions and billions into it and it has failed. So you can't know exactly how this voice will work in practice, and there's absolutely no way you can guarantee concrete results. It sort of bothers me that under this heading we have nothing explaining how we're going to get these concrete results, and we have some touchy-feely statements about shared 65,000 years of history, sending a powerful message to the world. Like, fuck the rest of the world. We're altering our constitution here. And you've got making a practical difference, but no detail, no other points backing that up. This is one of the shortest points on the yes side, and it is absolutely one of the most important things you need to convince people of. That's very disappointing. It's basically they've printed a bunch of feel-good bullshit here. Gets activists out on the campaign trail and maybe to the polls, although we have compulsory voting in Australia anyway, but stuff like this, the feel-good stuff, has never won a referendum. And in my humble opinion, probably never will. You need to do more on that. Ensure people have a better life. Kind of ties into the previous point. And again, impossible to state with an acceptable level of certainty. Yes, we want to deliver big improvements in, life expectancy, infant mortality, education, employment, of course. But the current approach might be, if not broken, then not working all that well. But where's the detail backing that up? How? It just says it will. It doesn't say how. The voice is our best chance. No one thinks it will instantly solve everyone. Give us something, please. It's too important to just throw out a bunch of statements without any data, any legalese backing it up. Brings the country together. Possibly true, although any democratic process with sizable percentages on both sides are going to affect some division. That, again, is part of the process. It's inherent in the democratic tradition. But, again, feeling good about myself for doing what a particular group of Australians want is not a reason that factors in, at least for me, when I'm being asked to change the founding legal document of our nation. Bringing the country together, there's also, you can bring the country together by instituting one-party rule. It doesn't mean anything on the ground. Saves money. Potentially a really valuable point. A voice will help us listen to locals and save money. Great. Where's the detail? Where is... Why couldn't you have said how it will save money? You give us a couple of examples. What other Indigenous advisory bodies can be wrapped up and rolled into this voice? What functions can the voice take over that are currently taken over by non-representative bureaucrats in a Canberra department somewhere? What wasteful infrastructure spending will finally get to the front lines of communities like Fitzroy Crossing or Alice Springs? Where is any of that? Saves you involve people, you make better decisions, and the money you spend goes where it's needed most. That was the same principle governing ATSIC, and it didn't work. The time is now, which I guess is saying, if not now, then when, which is true. Many decades in the making, hard work, goodwill, all true. And it's also true that we're unlikely to repeat this process anytime soon. But worse everything if we don't, better everything if we do, doesn't automatically imply accepting that we can't do better. Doesn't really imply anything, but I guess that's a running theme as well. Practical advice that works. I guess it's the most important part of this whole journey. And I wish they'd spent more than 6 sentences on it. It's another really short part of the yes case, which is a shame. The best way to give people an idea of practical advice that works would have been to include an example or two, like these residents from Broome had this proposal to get Indigenous students to stay in class instead of wagging early every day. This interest or cultural endeavour made school relevant for them, putting the curriculum in familial terms, cultural terms that they could be proud of, make them feel like they were working towards something, encouraged these students to stay in class. These ideas would be applicable to other Indigenous communities. That would have been great. That would have been fantastic to see, and makes government work better. Senior lawyers and high court judges are part of every referendum process, obviously, and it makes perfect sense that better advice should deliver better outcomes, but past endeavours with government bodies set up for this explicit purpose haven't made the government work better. So it's hard to blame people for being sceptical that the voice is the magic bullet. It has come from the most well-respected and intelligent Aboriginal leaders Australia has to offer, though, and there's been serious and ongoing in-depth consultation, which is why it was ridiculous for Malcolm Turnbull to come out the day after and claim it'd be a third chamber of parliament. This is definitely our best shot at improving things for Aboriginal people to date. So I think we can safely ignore people on Twitter screaming racism or Malcolm Turnbull's magical about face after declaring the third chamber of parliament as Liberal PM, and make an informed and respectable decision. But you're always going to get celebrities virtue signalling to their mates and posting for clout on Twitter. In fact, that is what respectable long-time journalist Ray Martin himself has been accused of. Let's check out what he said.
There's nothing hidden, in the words of the referendum. No ulterior motives, no conspiracy, nothing that has to be explained. If you don't know, vote no. What a stupid, nonsensical slogan that is. If you don't know, find out what you don't know.
Find out what you don't know. Normally, I would agree with him. That is step one in the democratic process. Find out what you don't know and then use it to inform your votes. But it's pretty hard to find out the how the voice will be legislated if it hasn't happened yet. And if we did know that, it might be a little more likely to fall by the wayside. Current odds, yes, 4.75, no, $1.15. It's not looking great. But then we have this this interesting response from the Sky News After Dark crowd, who I know everyone who reads The Guardian actually loves. Let's see what they thought about Ray's little speech.
I think you're right not to be complacent, because I think a lot of pundits are looking at the polls and going, this thing is doomed. I said when it was polling around 70% that it would be defeated. I always thought it would be, but there is no denying that the yes camp has got advantages that the no camp does not, including a massive war chest. We're talking around $100 million. We've never seen anything like this in an Australian political campaign. That amount of money being spent in a short period of time, saturation ads, and then this chicanery with the AEC, that the signage that is almost identical to the AEC, deliberately so. Then we've got putting out messages, and then the AEC itself revealing on Twitter, or X as it's now called, that you can vote multiple times. They, of course, don't encourage it, but they said that if you...
I think we should maybe examine a couple of those claims. Let's do a little bit of typing. Okay. So we've got Ray. If you don't know, find out. And Rita. Camp has funding advantages. AEC telling people they can vote twice. All right, we've checked out Ray's little "if you don't know, find out what you don't know." Pretty hard to do. Let's have a look at Rita's claims. Does the yes camp have access to more resources than the no camp, is what she's saying. This is not exactly the claim that the federal government is bankrolling, but it has been said. And no, the federal government is not bankrolling the Yes campaign. They have provided a small amount of funding to both sides to develop our official fancy pamphlet here. Let's see what RMIT have to say. Both the Yes and No campaigns are funded by private donations, and both were granted tax deductibility status. Okay. government throwing money towards the Yes campaign. Not happening. Giving tax exemptions to organisations supporting Yes. True, but also true for no. So that is false. That's not corrupt. It's not malfeasance. Government is not allowed to fund yes or no campaigns. So I think the key point here is we know both campaigns have tax exemption. Both campaigns have access to privately donated resources. And I believe it is true that the Yes campaign has significantly more private donations. Eat money behind the No campaign. $17 million to support Voice campaign. Top philanthropist saying yes. Okay. Paul Ramsey Foundation, $5 million. No public money. Can we get a comparison of either of these? Yes versus no campaign funding. Maybe RMIT have a little more information on it. Government is paying for a neutral civics education program. Is a neutral civics education program supporting the Yes campaign? Museum of Australian Democracy. Vote. Old Parliament House. Exhibitions. Voice. Jesus Christ, come on. Oh my God. Voice from the past. Our House, Our Voices. Power of One Voice. Nothing explicitly supporting the Yes campaign. It's a democratic museum. It talks about past events and referendums. The Apology, 10 years on. Nothing there explicitly supporting the Voice, so RMIT might be right about that. About the Constitution Education Fund Australia. Voice. Oh, so much text. Why aren't young Australians interested in voting? Attitudes to democracy. Implementation of a school parliament. Again, very little, if anything, about the Voice here, and certainly nothing explicitly supporting. So it looks like a neutral civics education and awareness program is just a neutral civics education and awareness program. Government allocated a total of 10.6 million. That's to prepare both cases. Yes and no, privately funded. On the yes side, a group of Australia's richest philanthropists pledged 17 million on the yes side, while Simon Fendwick, no idea who that is one of the biggest backers of the no campaign with a whopping 250k. Oh. No Voice campaign funding. Indigenous Land Ventures. so far contributed 750k. Well, it's still got nothing on the... Oh, well, here we go. Clive Palmer with another 2. We got Clive Palmer with 2. Simon Benwick with 750. Advance Australia, that's not explicitly for the campaign. Anti-Chinese Communist Party donations. It's very difficult to find the total amount of cash privately invested in the No campaign. But it looks like the Yes campaign is getting significantly more private donations, which is not unexpected. I would assume that to be the case. In fact, a couple of months ago, I would have assumed most of Australia was on board with the Yes campaign. But if we have a look at polling over time, on July 2023, it has dipped below polling aggregates. Keep in mind, there's quite a bit of scatter here, but we do have a very obvious trend line here. Dipping below 50%. Remember, we need a majority of voters in a majority of states. So we need more than 50% of the country's total population and at least 4 of the 6 states to vote yes. And for likely a variety of reasons, as the date has drawn closer, support has dipped below 40%, and that is probably why we have betting odds that look like a blowout. $1.15 on the No. That's nothing. That is the money market's assuming an almost certainty. What are some of the polls we have here specifically? Resolve, 44% yes. Essential, 45. Never heard of SEC. Redbridge. News poll, 41. News poll, 39. News poll, 37. Oof. So let's ask ourselves why that might be the case. News poll likely polls in more conservative areas, because if we look at these other polls, News poll tends to be the lowest among polls taken at that point in time, except for this Redbridge polls, but I don't know anything about Redbridge. This is the 36.96% support is the lowest support recorded to date. And it suggests that the referendum is going to be defeated, which is not something No supporters should be cheering about, even though it is their preferred outcome. I don't think it's going to be a good thing for Aboriginal and other ethnic group relations in this country when this fails. I think it's going to be incumbent on the No supporters in Parliament, the Liberal Party, the National Party, the Indigenous Australians like Jacinta Price, who have been very vocal against the Voice. It's going to be incumbent on them to come up with ways to get ideas and funding to where it's needed on the ground to make some sort of practical difference. Because if you're not going to do it this way, you really need some other sort of alternative. But that said, I don't think this should have ever been a constitutional referendum question in the first place. A Voice could easily have been legislated by an incoming Albo government. He could have simply said, we're going to legislate this for 3 years. South Australia, I believe, is already doing its own its own state level Voice. SA First Nations Voice will be made up of community members elected by ATSI people in South Australia to represent their communities and provide advice on laws. This is a mirror image of what the current referendum is asking us to support in the Constitution. There was no change to the South Australian Constitution to make this happen. They just got on and did it. This will enable more informed and inclusive decision making about issues that matter most to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their communities. So if South Australia can do it, the Victorian government's been talking about establishing treaties, although that's an entirely separate issue, and there are a number of reasons why I don't think that is a good idea. Treaties are typically established between two nations. We are one nation, Australia. So there are other issues with that, but the voice could have been legislated by the National Parliament. Why does it need to be permanently in the Constitution? There are other ways to achieve the recognition that the constitutional referendum is talking about when it suggests establishing the voice. And that, I wouldn't call it overreach, again, because this idea came directly from the best that our country has to offer. The best Aboriginal, the smartest and most politically active Aboriginal people in the country came up with this voice after extensive consultation over a very, very long period of time. It's detailed. There's something like 40 pages backing up the Uluru Statement from the Heart. It's detailed. They've thought about it. They've thought it through. But I don't think it needs to be in the Constitution. I think it can just be legislated by the government. We could have had this up and running already. And then if 10 years down the track, the government changes, it doesn't work, it becomes another ATSIC, we can shut it down and try something else. We could have another Uluru Statement from the Heart 2.0. We could have another voice, some other type of body, if it doesn't work, but we just don't know until we've tried it, and we didn't want to try it until it was locked into the Constitution forever. Referendums fail at the best of times. It is so difficult to change the Constitution in Australia and in most other countries around the world. An easily changeable Constitution might as well not exist because it's just reaffirming the political views of the day. And that's not what a Constitution is supposed to do. It's a founding legal document. Our politicians already treat it with borderline disdain, I would argue. And I think it's a little bit disdainful to say to people, hey, give us the power to put a voice in the Constitution and we'll legislate the details after. When you could have either presented the details beforehand and been more upfront and honest about it, or legislated it, let it run, look for improvements, look for trends up in Aboriginal life expectancy, infant mortality, education, and then put it in the Constitution down the track if it works. Why would we want... Imagine if we'd had ATSIC in the Constitution. It would have been a disaster. And this could be a disaster. I'm not saying that's a likely outcome, but it's entirely possible. And asking us to lock it into the Constitution it's a risk. It's a risk, and when it comes to changing the Constitution, the vast majority of people, every referendum that's ever been held, every single one, have just passed or failed miserably. The last one we had failed. I think the last successful referendum was, in fact, giving Aboriginal people the vote. Australia. Referendum dates. 1906, Senate elections, state debts. Okay, preamble 99, Republic 99, both failed. Right to trial by jury, interesting, failed. Freedom of religion, failed. Ensure fair terms for people whose property the government takes, failed. Interesting. Recognising local government in the Constitution, failed. We already have too much government in this country. Fair elections, to provide for fair and democratic parliamentary elections throughout Australia, failed. Parliamentary terms, 4-year term limits for members of both houses, failed. Interchange of powers to enable Commonwealth and the states to voluntarily refer powers to each other. Oof, just failed. Terms of senators, so they are no longer fixed, and to provide that the election for both houses are always on the same day. Failed, although passed in, is it New South Wales and Victoria? States that voted in favour. Of course it was New South Wales and Victoria. Victoria being the most progressive state in the country. Most cities are fairly progressive, and then the further out you go, just like in the US, the more conservative you become. Retirement of judges, to provide for retiring ages for judges of federal courts. Interesting. So even we here in Australia don't want lifetime appointments. Carried 80%. Okay, so that was the last successful referendum in 1977. Also in 1977, referendums on territories to allow electors in territories as well as states to vote in constitutional referendums. That's reasonable because they're Australian citizens. Also carried. Senate casual vacancies. Casual vacancy in the Senate is filled by a person of the same political party, and that the person shall hold the seat for the balance of the term. Carried after the 1975 madness. Simultaneous elections, not carried. Who cares about simultaneous elections? Interesting. New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia supporting, and 62% of the nation supporting, but without 4 states on board, it doesn't happen. It's a high bar, and it should be. Local government bodies also not carried. Where is... Here we go. This is the important one. It's 1967, so we have had a successful referendum since then. To enable the Commonwealth to enact laws for Aboriginal people, to remove the prohibition against counting Aboriginal people in population counts in the Commonwealth or a state. All states supporting, 90.7% carried. There it is. That shows that we clearly as a nation don't want to keep Aboriginal people out in the dust, impoverished, with low life expectancies and high infant mortalities. We want to do the right thing. Maybe the voice is simply not the right thing, but it is exactly what they want, so you have to account for that. I think that's all for today. Thanks for listening. Cheerio.